Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, 12 Tips to Stay Safer Online. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few housekeeping items. So all callers will be muted. If you lose your internet connection, just try refreshing the browser that was emailed to you, and then you should be able to reconnect. If you have to drop off early, we will be recording the webinar, and we'll be sending out the slides and a link to the recording once the webinar is over. And it will be hosted on our site, TechSoup.org/community/events-webinars. If you're on social media, feel free to send us a tweet at TechSoup. But like I said earlier, all callers will be muted, and we'll be taking questions on the chat box that you should see on the left-hand side of your screen. So just a little bit about TechSoup. We are in 236 countries and territories, and we serve over 1 million nonprofits around the world. We partner with technology organizations like Adobe, Amazon Web Services, Intuit, Microsoft, Symantec, and several others that you see here. And they help make our mission possible. And we distribute donated, discounted, or free technology to nonprofits around the world. If you're interested in finding out what is available to your nonprofit, there is a link that you see here at the bottom. And you can go there to explore what might be available to your nonprofit. So just before we get started, I wanted to go ahead and introduce everyone who's on the webinar today. So my name is Seema Tucker, and I'm the Senior Manager of Content here at TechSoup. I also have my colleague Zareen, who's going to be helping out on the back end with chat. And then our main presenter today is Michael Enos, and he's going to be sharing his security tips with you. So Michael Enos is the Senior Director of Community and Platform for TechSoup. He directs DevOps, enterprise infrastructure, information and technology security, and software development teams that build and support platform products and services. Michael also earned his MBA from Santa Clara University. His professional career in technology began in 1996. He was a systems admin for a Bay Area nonprofit that served adults in need. And then he transitioned into a role as a technical consultant developing data systems to help measure and track service quality to the individuals being served. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Michael.
Great. Thank you, Seema. Hello, everybody. And thanks for joining us today. So, why are we here today? We're here today essentially to be focused on, in general, sort of online safety and how to be and the behavior and that we engage in terms of our interaction with the internet and how to be safe, and also how that can help protect data. And one of the main reasons to remember why it is we are concerned about internet safety and cybersecurity is really about both protecting the systems that our organizations use to deliver the services that provide the impact in the communities, but also to protect the data of our constituents and ourselves as we work to improve civil society. So to that extent, that's sort of the real impetus between why it is always good to have safety and cybersecurity front and center. The scope of this, what we're talking about today, is really about the way we engage with the internet. We're not going to be going into details and specifics around how to protect your servers, your systems, really with hardened tools and how to test against vulnerabilities. This isn't geared so much for system admins and people who are network engineers, as it is the end users who actually use the systems of the organization, and the best and some we're going to go through 12 basic tips and content around best practices in this space about how to be safe online. So with that, we're going to start with essentially some tip number one, which is how to make it more difficult for people who want to actually take some of your data. And we can usually characterize them as hackers. There's lots of other words for people who are trying to attempt to take something that's sensitive to us in terms of our data through the various tools that they have access to do so. And so obviously there's some best practices around password use. And it's really one of the things is that so you could make it more difficult is to use different passwords for different websites. If you use the same username and password for all all the things you access online, all the your bank and your emails and such, then if one of those passwords becomes compromised, then they'll have access to, they can just start doing scripts and run it against all different kinds of online applications and find out what else you've signed up for, and then use that to exploit it. Most modern web applications and internet applications will allow you to use two-factor authentication, and that's highly recommended because as we'll discuss, this will come out multiple times in today's webinar, that essentially the idea behind two-factor authentication, loosely simply stated, is the two factors are something that you have and something that you know. So that's why it is oftentimes we use a phone. They'll send a digit to the phone, and then for example, the PIN code for your phone or your password, or they'll send you a code, and so that's something you know and something you own. Another simple example is when you get gas at a gas station and it asks for your zip code. You've used your credit card, that's something you have, and then you type in your zip code, that's something you know. So very basic concept, but it's very effective. Generally, it's not impervious, but it can be effective. The other thing is to make sure all your software is up to date. Oftentimes, vulnerabilities, what we call vulnerabilities, happen because the code has not been updated, and somebody's learned how to exploit a vulnerability. And when people write software, as we know, that's not always perfect, and there may be some way that somebody could get into the code and breach the code and then exploit something. And so it's really important to keep your software update, and especially security updates for your operating systems and antivirus definitions. Then when possible, is to set up spam blockers or ways to prevent email from coming in, or for you to receive messages that will will have content in it, like links to things that are obviously spam and or phishing attempts. So that's tip number one. Tip number two is there's some simple ways that we can actually deter deceit. Essentially what we want to do is we want to, people, and groups are always trying to find ways to, sort of fish for information from you. And they're going to be using tools and techniques that are tested to, socially engineered to have us do something just sort of because it seems like it makes sense. I mean, for example, there'll be a click to a LinkedIn profile, and it'll look like somebody actually or it'll say there'll be something from that says from your IT department, and actually in the header of the message it'll show somebody and it'll say hey, the IT department is asking you to reset your password. It's really important that never divulge any information if it's sensitive information because somebody's asking you for it in an email until you've actually called up the person and talked to the person personally. Or if there's nobody would really in the modern day and age actually ask for your social security number, your password, or any sense of your date of birth over an email or something where you're going to be typing it in. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more in terms of how to be cautious about the kinds of things you share. The other important thing is to pay attention to the address bar and the URLs that are actually in your Internet Explorer. When you're, for example, if you see an email and it's something you may have an interest in, like maybe it's somebody sends an email and it says, hey, are you interested in going to this conference? And you're going to have to sign up to register for the conference. If you're signing up for something, it's going to be asking you for information. It's always good to check if you click on that link and it doesn't actually have a certificate and it doesn't show the actual name of the actual conference organizer. Then that's the reason to be suspect. And then and people do this all the time. They know people are in certain industries, and they'll send things to see if you could sign up for something, and they'll use that as a way to try to collect information. Obviously, you'll see in the top of the bar the HTTPS. You could look at the certificate. Certificates are only issued to organizations that can validate themselves as that organization. I cannot get an organization. I cannot get a certificate for TechSoup.org unless I can prove that I'm authorized to do so. So that's probably the easiest way to check. So tip number 3, establish policies for staff and volunteers. It's important that people who work in the organization and the volunteers in the organization, even board members, have some clear understanding about how to be safe themselves and how the policies that you have. It's important that organizations have a cybersecurity awareness training program and that it's made mandatory for the staff so that people can become oriented to these ideas, and they can have go through this kind of webinar or get information as like the type I'm sharing with you all today, so that they could be actively part of protecting the organization's information systems and data. The other thing is that besides having a training program, it's important that the organization, as part of the human resources group, has an acceptable use policy so that people understand that the assets that are used, including the computer systems, the information systems, that all those things are owned by the company and are part of the brand and reputation of the company. And so anything that you're doing that when you're using the devices that are issued to you, or you're using anything that represents the organization or acting on behalf of the organization, that you're doing so within what's acceptably been made policy by the organization. And once again, it's if your organization where there's applications that are being used, if those applications could support single sign-on or identity management, such as multi-factor authentication, using identity management services such as Microsoft Active Directory Federation Services or Okta, that helps in maintaining some of those policies for an organization, for the staff and volunteers. Tip number 4 is to essentially secure mobile devices and workstations. As we move more and more to being able to have access to organizations' resources in the cloud, such as email and the donor management systems or whatever tools are being used by the organization, people are using them away from the office. They're using them using laptops and mobile devices. And it's very important for an organization to understand that and to create policies so that those devices are, number one, that they're secured, that somebody just can't open them up and simply see a screen and then start going to websites and things that contain information that is sensitive. So obviously we want to make sure that that you're required to log into the computer, that any data that's stored locally on the computer is encrypted. That's if it's sensitive information. So for example, if you're in a field and you're actually collecting information from individuals in the field because you're doing something like you're signing people up for some outreach, that you've created tools on your computer to ensure that if something happened to the computer, that they couldn't that information about that individual or the person you're serving cannot be compromised, nor can, so for example, the donor, the information of your donors or grant funders. And so this is and that also goes without saying that the end devices need to be able to potentially be remotely swiped by the organization if there's a breach, if you felt as though you've lost it. Most important thing to do is contact your IT department, if you have one, or contact somebody in your organization who's ever in charge of the information assets, and let them know that your device has been lost or stolen, so that they could essentially manage the risk there that's associated with that. Number 5, be diligent when you use public computers. I know that this is something that people are probably using less and less of, kiosks, internet kiosks, or libraries where there are computers, but there are sometimes people are traveling and they're using in a hotel and they want to use a computer in the hotel lobby to check their email because their phone's charging or something. So what's important is that you have to pretend as though whatever you're doing on the computer is not, that somebody could, that network is not a network that's controlled. You have no control over the sort of security of that network. So likewise, you don't know who's going to be on the computer after you. And so doing things like loading information in from a thumb drive, or and then loading the information in there, copying it to never copy anything onto the computer from a thumb drive. In fact, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but using thumb drives at all, you should be very, very wary of, because they could be lost and stolen and somebody could put it in their computer. If it's not encrypted, it's not password protected, whatever's on that could be easily stolen by somebody else. The other thing is just something as simple as making sure that nobody's looking over your shoulder if you're entering in information. Public computers, if they're on a network, people could they could have a key logging software on there where they could actually, even if you're typing something in, they can't see it, they could actually capture that. So you have to be really, particularly cautious when using computers that are in public areas. Basically, and what's related to this is tip number 6, that using public Wi-Fi is similar. You're essentially, it's not quite as, there's a little bit less risk in this, but there's still risk because you're essentially on a network where if you're using somebody else's Wi-Fi, where there's somebody else could be on the same network and they could scan the ports on your computer, they could find out if there's available services, and they could exploit a vulnerability if your software is not up to date, and then actually go into your computer while you're working, you don't even know it, and they're going in and trying to find anything like social security numbers or something on your computer. A couple different ways that you could sort of mitigate that risk is by, if when possible, using your cell phone as a mobile hotspot as opposed to using a public Wi-Fi. If you have that capability, if you have a cell plan that allows for that, that is better than using a public network, because it's really, you've just created the network on your phone, and that's more secure. Alternatively, if you have a VPN, virtual private network, if you have that, if you're on a public space, you can use the VPN, and that creates a secure tunnel, and it's less likely that somebody could hack into that secure tunnel. If you're but if you're needing to use public Wi-Fi, be very cautious, like I talked about in the last slide, in terms of the kinds of information and kind of work that you would be doing in that space. And I will answer questions at the end of the session. I see some questions popping up, so bear with me now, and then at the end we'll have some time for questions and answers. Tip number 7, and this kind of goes without saying, but it's social media is social. It's a place where people can and sometimes do share things that are both not just about their organization but also personal. If you're using social media for your organization, it's really important to remember that everything that happens in that platform is permanent. It can be, somebody can make a screenshot of it. It happens. It's there. It's never going to disappear. And the other thing is that if there's anything that's happening in social media, it's oftentimes can be used as a way to gather information about you or the organization. And so somebody could come in and say that they're interested in your organization. They want you to go and get some more information about the organization, and they could be luring you into essentially a phishing attempt to gather information about your company. And so that's something always to be wary of if you're in that role. And the other thing is to consider your company's code of conduct. If you're representing the organization, whatever you do on social media, even if it's your own personal Facebook account, if you work for an organization, there's and depending on your organization's code of conduct, you maybe want to be sensitive to the fact that you are representing that organization, and that if your beliefs and what you stand for the organization may be different what you stand for as an individual, that you need to be highly cognizant of that if you're in a situation where you are in a role in that organization where you are one that's representing the organization. And there's no hard and fast rules around that, and that's why you should always seek the counsel of your organization to ask for what's acceptable and what's not acceptable. Moving right along, number 8, a lot of these are related, the ones especially around information sharing. And this goes for both your organization and yourself. And a lot of what I'm talking about here is, like I mentioned in the beginning, it's not just about what how to protect your organization and its information and data, but also about your own. Some of the same rules apply. So, personal details about yourself can be essentially used to then impersonate yourself. And so, it is important to remember that anything you share about yourself, somebody can use and may use in order to attempt to, do something on your behalf. And so, it may be, and some of the general rules of thumb here is that it's really, if you're posting things in a social media platform, and you have a responsibility to your organization, it's important to only say things that you would be comfortable saying, like if it was going to end up on the front page of the paper. And so it's social media is a great tool. It's a wonderful tool, but we also know that if you're sometimes what people say is if you're thinking about responding to something in a negative way, to just write it down on a piece of paper and come back to it a day later and see if that's really what you felt. You should really use common sense when actually thinking about how it is that you're being represented, if you're especially if you're working, if you're representing your organization. Number 9, and once again, this is about how your organization is using social media. The staff and volunteers who are, maybe monitoring, maybe writing blog posts, maybe they're, making Instagram photographs, really need to be trained on how to, make sure that what they're, how they're representing the organization is doing so in a way that the organization, how they'd want to be represented. And there should be social media policies within the organization around these activities if you have that role. If not, it would be great to work with your marketing or content teams on creating policies. And it's also important to assign roles. And oftentimes somebody will, if they're in a content writing role, they'll have somebody who's in sort of a publishing role so they can actually check the content and vet it so that to make sure that it is representative of the messaging that the organization is wanting to message out. Number 10, exercise caution with logins and limit access to shared files. Right now, in the current day and age, we have access to so many different applications where you could start, you could just do a free trial for something, like Box or Google or any Wrike, any sort of application, and then create use your work email address and then start using it. And then say, oh, I want to share this, or I've created some assets here and I want to share them. It's really important to understand the ramifications of that if you're going to then maybe down the road somebody's going to be sharing something else, and you've already shared that asset, that resource to somebody who really shouldn't have party to that information. It's very common now that we can have, that people will just be trying to get something done and they'll create a share for maybe a volunteer or somebody to the personal email address. And when, as a general rule of thumb, it's always important to, if you're sharing information, to share something with somebody to their, and they're going to be outside your organization, that you would use their organization's email address, because there's an assumption there that if that person's not working at that organization anymore, then they wouldn't have access to that organization's email address. If you're sharing information, when you must share something with somebody with a private email address, you have to remember that that email address, the person could always recover that information and that asset, and then it may be difficult actually to not have that person have access to that resource. If you unshare it, they could have actually taken that information and then repurposed it onto another drive and then be sharing it elsewhere. So a lot of it's important to take in consideration that when using new tools, using the internet to do work. And that's why there's oftentimes, hopefully in organizations, developing clear policies and security controls around file sharing. If there's sensitive information, for example, if there's customer data or it's your client information, you should make it impossible for people to actually download it or to share it, from the get-go. And there should be some security controls around that so that somebody can't, share a donor list or a customer contact sheet. Familiarize yourself with cloud providers' policies. When the online tools that we use, such as I'll just name a few. Like let's say your organization is using Slack, or it's using Zoom, or it's using Box. There'll be sort of default system configuration that are sort of spun up when you actually start using it. Oftentimes, though, those won't actually be aligned with your organization's, let's say, like data retention policies, or the ability to, if somebody, let's say you're using a messaging tool like Slack or one of those types of tools, and you're actually using it within your company's environment for communication, there's likely the need for you to be able to undelete something that was deleted, for example. And if the policy, if it was by default that tool does not allow you to undelete something that was deleted as a system from an IT perspective, then that could be something that could be detrimental to your organization's because it could be, for legal reasons, somebody may need to go and find out exactly what was deleted and to understand that. And so there's, so especially around things like data retention, backup policies, it's important that you understand that for whatever cloud resource that you're using. And oftentimes you have to be an admin, and you go into the administrative settings, and you can say, oh look, there's password, we can make the password stronger, or we could retain data longer, or we could, if somebody leaves the organization, we can have it automatically move to somebody else's authority. So it's really important to become familiar with your cloud provider's policies. And the last tip before we get into questions and answers is about offline backups. And this is a question that comes up a lot. When is it appropriate to, if you're using a cloud resource, to actually make a backup of that information? And when is it something where should we always just trust the cloud resource that they're making backups and you'll be able to have them restored? And that's a difficult one. But I think a general rule of thumb is that if the data is critical to the day-to-day operations of your organization, and it's potential that the organization would not be able to function if you didn't have access to that information, and you could assume that at some point you will not have access to the internet, then there should be some mechanism in place to allow for business continuity should it be disrupted. In California, we think about, okay, well, if there's an earthquake and we didn't have access to the internet, would the business still be able to function, and for how long until we were able to restore internet connectivity? When I worked at the food bank in Santa Clara, San Mateo counties, it was really important that we were able to continue to distribute food and out the door if we did not have internet capabilities. So we intentionally ensured that we had local backups of certain types of data. However, we had to ensure that it was encrypted, that it was available, backups were encrypted, they were stored on site, but we'd only be able to have to use that information, that data, if in an emergency, and we'd actually practice that. Now that's an extreme example, but there are organizations that are in the sector that are going to be dependent as first responders in case of a national disaster, and will need local information, and may not have information, not be able to connect to the cloud to access that. And so it's just important to use caution when doing so, because about things that are said earlier, having information local on your devices that is sensitive needs to be you need to have take extra care with that in case the device is compromised. So with that, I think we could turn to some questions.
All right, thank you, Michael. So we have several questions that have come in. So the first question is, somebody was asking about job applications and if they require a Social Security number. How would you handle that particular situation?
If I would probably if it's an online job application, you're asking if you're filling out a form online and it's asking for your Social Security number. It's I would actually be hesitant to provide that information to an organization. To be frank with you, I would instead ask if there was a different way that you could transmit that information than entering it in on the computer. I mean, I think the places where people need Social Security numbers is if they're running a credit check or a background check. And so in that case, I think that could be fair for an organization. I know that in certain roles, it's mandatory that people run background checks. And I think in having been a hiring manager, if somebody has requested that they'd rather provide to me the Social Security number in a different format as opposed to the form I think that it's perfectly acceptable, and it wouldn't be used against an applicant. In fact, the applicant, the organization would probably feel like, oh, this person is actually taking this information security seriously.
Perfect. Another question, in terms of like nonprofits that are using, if they're collecting donations and there's financial information, do you have any kind of just like basic tips that they should be kind of following in that situation?
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to this firsthand. That in different roles that I've had, we've been had to help manage the security information policies for the collection of donor information that included financial information, and it's really important. I think that the main thing is educating the people who have and are working with that data, and ensuring that they're trained, that they have access to the appropriate tools to manage securely the information that's happening. I mean, we do have to work with sensitive information. That's part and parcel with a lot of the types of work that we do in the sector. I think that what's important is to identify the sensitive information, like in this case, maybe it's financial data, and then to ensure that it's secure by using a tool that actually has a security enterprise feature such as Box, or something where that the companies that platform is compliant to security controls, and then to ensure that that the tool, or if it's a donor software system, that and it's hosted somewhere, that you really understand that you want to look at the attestation of that particular software platform. They will provide for you attestation reports to if they have sensitive data, they're going to need to be held compliant. They're going to have compliance. There'll be compliance standards that they have to be held to, and they should be able to provide reports to you regarding that. I hope that answered that question.
Perfect, thank you. So you spoke earlier about VPNs and public Wi-Fis. Can you maybe offer some suggestions around mobile beacon hotspots, and are they typically considered safe or not safe?
Mobile beacon hotspots are similar to your cell phone. You're essentially it's a wireless channel that you have. It's creating a space. Now you're going to be authenticating. It's going to be asking for a PIN for that, and for you to be able to access that. And in those cases, even though it's if you're opening up the hotspot and you're allowing a group of people, if it's in those cases, it might be something where it would be used so that people could have general access to the internet, but not necessarily. For example, if you're accessing resources, you could use the mobile beacon hotspot and then deploy VPN to then more securely access something that was, for example, like your donor software system. If you're doing that and then going also to the donor software system, like let's say it's online, and you're using the mobile beacon hotspot for it, I would be cautious because because in that case you're kind of opening up. Somebody could potentially use the code that is on the mobile beacon hotspot, or somebody could grab that code that's on that hotspot, and then if it was left around, you have to be careful with any sort of device that's providing internet access. But that's better than essentially using a pre-wired like going into Starbucks or something like that.
Perfect. So in terms of social media, there's a lot of information that people have to put on their profiles, like their educational background, what cities they live in. In general, I think most organizations and companies encourage people to have a LinkedIn profile from a professional standpoint. How do you feel about I guess just even having a social media profile and offering all of that information, because people can put two and two together and kind of figure out a lot of personal information about you.
This is sort of the challenge of living in the modern world in a way, and I can respect that. There's I think that we want to be if we want to be engaged actors in civil society, there is a certain amount of ourselves we have to put forth, and I think that we just have to sort of ensure that we're doing it in such a way that it reduces the risk of doing that. So, for example, I don't know of social media platforms that ask for my what would we call the personally identifiable information. So, oftentimes what it is, it's secondary information. They're not asking for something that could actually then be used. Like, for example, if you're, I wouldn't share. I mean, that's why, for example, oftentimes if you get something from LinkedIn, you'll have to go to LinkedIn and then sign into LinkedIn, and then you can read the messages there. I'd be cautious about putting things in there that, such as where somebody could then create a profile that looks like you and then imitate you to then go to and send an email to somebody else saying, oh, I'm so-and-so, and can you give me this information? And I think that's, when you're creating a profile online, I think that it's prudent to be cautious about what you share and what you actually create in the profile. But if you're organizations do want us to use that so that we could garner support from people in the community. So it's sort of a double-edged sword there, and I think the best thing to do is to be conscious of it and go to the rule that essentially, are you providing something that's personally identifiable, like your street address or your phone number or your address. The platform itself may ask for your phone number so that it can authenticate you, but it's not going to ask for your phone number in a profile, unless you want to share it, for example, as part of your business, your business company, your company's phone number, but not your personal phone number.
So in terms of, that's really interesting. In terms of, I guess just kind of managing your own profiles that are out there, like I've ego surfed before where I type in my own name into Google, and I've seen, like white pages or things like that that have gotten information about me that I never submitted. Are there, I guess things that, that you can do as an individual to kind of have that removed, or just kind of keep an eye on what's actually out there that you never really kind of put out there in the first place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that there are, searching for yourself and trying to get it, is actually a good sort of basic way to, find out, what is out there for yourself. People who have the more unique your name, the more possibly time it'll be a little bit easier to find out exactly what it is that people think about you. Fortunately, I'm also a famous wrestler, so that's going to usurp almost any searches about me. But seriously, the and that's one of the things why we talked about earlier in this presentation to be careful about what you share. It's permanent. It's always going to be there, and it's possibly going to be searchable. You can go to you can request certain search engines. You can go that route, and there are some mechanisms, legal mechanisms in place to, especially if there's if something's known defaming, and I think that if there's no hard and fast rules there, but I think that just being cognizant of what it is that you're as you're creating that as you're doing things online, what it is that you're doing, knowing this is going to end up on the internet sometime.
All right, good to know. So going back to some of the technical questions, in terms of VPN, Justine was asking, is VPN as important when on your own organization's Wi-Fi network? And can you also maybe give like a brief description of kind of VPN and how it works?
Sorry, that's a really good question. In terms of your organization's Wi-Fi, it depends on how the Wi-Fi was set up. If the organization's Wi-Fi has oftentimes there'll be a sort of internal Wi-Fi for the staff and then a guest Wi-Fi. And the internal Wi-Fi will have access to things that are what we call behind the firewall. And there'll usually be a stronger enforced encryption. There's if your organization has to be PCI compliant, there's going to have been an audit that was done to ensure that your organization's internal Wi-Fi met certain security standards, so that somebody who's outside the building cannot actually use your Wi-Fi, your internal Wi-Fi, to access your company's resources. So you generally, in most cases, you wouldn't use your VPN to connect on your company's Wi-Fi, because essentially you are behind the firewall if it was appropriately set up. And that really depends on the sort of maturity level of your organization's IT. If it's in terms of VPN, if your company may just have guest access, and you could use that essentially to be sort of more like hardwired into essentially behind your company's firewalls, as we say. And the way that VPN essentially works, and what that is, it's essentially a secure. What happens is that a secure tunnel creates a trust between your device and your network, and that tunnel essentially allows traffic to, meaning the data that you're typing in and the data that you're retrieving from your company's resources behind the firewall. They're encrypted, they're hashed, they're very strongly encrypted. Somebody can't get in the middle of that and steal that information. And so it's basically as if you're sort of connected with a hard wire, to your, behind your company's firewall, so to speak. And so VPN, that technology stands for Virtual Private Network, meaning what you're doing is you've created sort of a private network away from your company's sort of internal network, but they're connected and trusted. And that's the main thing to do. There'll be controls in place to ensure there's trust relationship between the device and your company's infrastructure.
Great. And you also mentioned, so Peggy was wondering, in terms of, you mentioned the single sign-on software and password management. Do you recommend using a password lockbox? And if so, do you suggest a service?
There are great tools for password, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that wasn't necessarily something that, in terms of, that was part of the presentation in terms of a tip, but in terms of password management. But using a password management tool, there are several out there, and there's KeePass, there's a whole slew of them, and I use usually several of them, but it is important. So for example, for password management, to store them. So for example, if you have a whole bunch of passwords and you have trouble keeping track of them, you can put them essentially in a password management tool, and then you essentially have to use one very, very long key to actually get connected to that, and then that way you could access your passwords. The thing is with that is if you lose that one key, it's going to be difficult. There should be mechanisms in place using other types of authentication so that you could retrieve that. There are a growing number of online password management tools and that are becoming effective. And the best thing I would do is, because there's so many of them, is I would do some research and some due diligence in terms of ensuring that that was a tool that had been considered that is certified. They will provide, if it's a password management tool, they will have attestations as to their own security that you should research yourself and not just take it because it was reviewed by a PC Tech magazine.
Okay, and then when it comes to files and encryption, Julie was asking what is the easiest way to encrypt a file, a sensitive file, and then also we got another question about how do organizations know if their cloud environment encrypts their backup data. So could you maybe speak to kind of encryption and how that works?
Sure. So depending on the operating system, modern operating systems such as Windows 10 environment will have built into it like BitLocker or another tool to be able to essentially encrypt whatever's on your drive. And there's other tools that you can employ to encrypt just a particular folder on your computer. It really depends on the use case. If you want everything encrypted, or if you just need a place like in your a documents file to have encrypted information. And so there's different tools that are available, and it's important that you keep, whatever tool you use, that you keep it updated, because this is like another security tool like antivirus that could be exploited if somebody finds a vulnerability with that particular tool. So that's the first part of the question. The second part of the question was?
So the second part of the question was, how do organizations know if their cloud environment encrypts their backup data?
It should be in the most, I would have to say most if not all data that's in the cloud is being what we call encrypted at rest, meaning that somebody who is, let's say you were a server operator in AWS or a server operator at the place where these computers and servers are hosted, they couldn't log into that particular machine and then see, go to the C drive and look around and see actual real data. It's going to have been encrypted. That's what we call it, encrypted at rest. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't download it. So if you were to download it, it's all of a sudden it's not encrypted anymore. It's actually being decrypted on the fly, and then it actually comes in as real information unencrypted onto your desktop, downloaded. Like if you're downloading a Word file from Dropbox or Box, but actually there it's encrypted at rest, and it will generally for that platform, you should be able to ask the support support question about that, and they should be able to provide the answers. And actually, more importantly, they should be able to provide attestation to it, meaning that if this is their business providing you a place to work online, that they're in the business of also ensuring that your information is secure online, and they should be able to provide attestation to that from a third-party source.
All right, and we have a couple more questions here, and then I think we will wrap up. So Bernard was wondering, do you have any concerns or tips around utilizing Microsoft 365 or Google G Suite when it comes to managing organizational data, email, calendars, etc.?
I would have to say that if they're if either one of those platforms are properly configured, then they're safe to use as an organization. They are enterprise tools. Those companies themselves use those tools, and I think what's really important is about the way that the tools are used. For example, if you're using the G Suite set of products, then you'll want to make sure, for example, that it actually is your organization's. You have a domain set up. You're actually using G Suite as an organization, that you can administratively control the users. You can onboard and offboard users. You can set password policies. You can set the kinds of things that you would need, and also you could restrict sharing to people outside your organization, and you can set up all the configuration and management. And that's one of the things about cloud services in general, like as I mentioned earlier in the tips, is that by default they may not be set up. They generally are not set up to adhere to your company's policies or to the best security standards, and they have to be configured as such. I would have to say that I think the data, for the most part, in terms of they're backing up the data. They can, they have high availability. It's not impervious to data loss, but it's going to be 1,000 times more secure than probably anything you would spin up in your closet.
All right. And then in terms of single sign-on, do you, I guess it's inherently meant to be more secure, but have you seen any situations where it posed a risk, a security risk?
Yeah, I mean, nothing is completely pervious to threats and vulnerabilities. And I think if in terms of single sign-on, there's different ways that single sign-on is employed from a technical perspective. Sometimes it's employed usually sometimes as a simple sort of SAML integration. Sometimes it's more robust. And I think that once again, it's the simple answer is it depends how it's configured. In most cases, if you're using a tool like Okta, or if you're using Microsoft Active Directory Federation Services for single sign-on, or even Google for single sign-on, as long as you've set up those single sign-on policies to be essentially appropriate in terms of security, then that is going to be that is going to work for you. I think the one thing about single sign-on that happens that I think I could give a tip about real fast is that oftentimes that information is cached in your browser. And so if you, for example, that's why you can actually go and open up a new tab, and all of a sudden you're still there in that same window, and you don't have to re-sign back into Facebook. Now all these things are great, but they also mean that we have to pay more attention to ensuring that our browser windows are closed, that we close them out, and then we lock our computers, because otherwise somebody could open our computer, and if they were able to see our screen and our browser, all that single sign-on information is cached across all the the different browsers that we have, and they can they may have to sign back into your bank account because there's that timeout feature that happens, but that's only in like certain applications, and not in all applications. So they could essentially and we all know somebody who's, had their Facebook post, there's like, who did that? And it was because you left your computer unattended.
All right. I think we are all feeling thoroughly paranoid, so it's a good time to wrap up the webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Thank you, Michael, for all of that information. We love hearing your feedback, so if you have any feedback on today's webinar, you can chat one thing that you learned in the webinar, but even better if you could take our post-event survey. It helps us dictate future content and what really helps your organization. We're also on social media, so if you're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, feel free to give us a follow. We also have a blog, which is blog.techsoup.org, and we post lots of tips and tricks and how-tos and things like that over there. We also have several webinars that are happening in October, so if you're interested in joining us for an upcoming webinar, you can go to our website at the URL that you see below to register for those. Again, I want to thank Michael for the great presentation today, Zareen for helping on the back end, and to you guys for attending and staying on for this long, and also to our webinar sponsor, ReadyTalk. Thank you so much.